Hi, could you please give me your name and what you are doing mainly, and then I can ask the questions.
Yeah, so my name is Aaronom Shurgerem. I have a lab at Neurospin Research Center, which is about 15 kilometers south of Paris, where we primarily do cognitive neuroimaging research. I work for the INSERM. The INSERM is sort of the French equivalent of the National Institutes of Health in the US. Right now I'm doing research on the self-initiation of action, the voluntary, spontaneous voluntary action. How does the brain initiate an action when there's no cue in the environment telling you when to perform that action?
And this was your talk about that research?
It was about that research, yeah. And about its implications for some prior research that's been highly influential.
What is the main idea of research?
Of my research?
Of your research, yes.
It's to build a computational model a computational model for spontaneous self-initiated movement that can be used to make predictions in tasks of that sort, where subjects initiate actions spontaneously without a cue. Without a cue? A cue is, for example, if I tell you, press that button when you see that green light. The green light is the cue. So sometimes we perform actions in everyday life that are cued. For example, when you're driving and the light turns red and you press on the brake, so the red light is the cue, and there's a stimulus response kind of interaction. But some of our actions are not cued. For example, at some moment you reach for your drink on the table and you take a drink. There was no sound or light telling you, now it's time to go get your next drink.
But you may explain it through inner, reflex or something.
Well, the way we try to explain it is in terms of decision-making circuits in the brain that seem to work based on many years of research in decision-making, that these circuits work by the accumulation of evidence in favor of one option or the other. And what we've tried to argue is that same kind of model can be used to account for actions that are initiated spontaneously.
What do you mean by this decision? So what's your criteria that I made a decision?
In a sense, we use the word decision, I think, in a very abstract way. Effectively, anytime you perform some sort of an action, you've made some kind of a decision. So if you reach for your drink, you've made a decision to reach for your drink. Or the brain has made a decision.
Even if I do it kind of unconsciously?
Yeah, then... So the way we use the word decision, it doesn't mean a conscious decision. Just means, in general, a decision in the brain. So it's kind of behavior. If I'm doing some kind of behavior, you mean that you have taken some kind of your brain has taken some kind of a decision, even if, as you say, maybe that decision is unconscious. It's still a decision. Right. And how it's connected with free will in case if it could be unconscious decision? Well, I think our work doesn't directly make any big pronouncements about free will, whether we have it or whether we don't. But as I understand, you told that we have a free will. I tried not to say that we have free will. I tried not to give that impression. But, why? Well, because what we've done is we've looked at the evidence that's been used to argue against free will, and we've shown that evidence is wrong. And that evidence needs to be interpreted in a different way. You mean Libet experiment? Yeah, Libet experiment. The interpretation of that experiment that has been dominant for some decades, we believe is not the correct interpretation. And so, therefore, what is supposedly evidence against free will doesn't count as evidence against free will. Okay. So maybe you could say we've brought it back to zero. Okay. And what is your main idea of arguing with this interpretation? The idea, well, it comes back to this phenomenon called the readiness potential. Are you familiar with the readiness potential? So this is the readiness potential is a buildup of electrical potential over the motor areas of the brain, roughly over the motor strip.
This is I understand.
That appears before you make a voluntary movement. So this potential, which is reflecting neural activity, is building up from 1 second even before movement, or even more. It's slowly building up, reaching its peak right around the time of movement. So this was, when this was discovered in the mid-1960s, it was assumed that it was a reflection of some process of planning and preparation for movement. And later, in the 80s, Libet or Libet used that readiness potential to show or to suggest that the conscious decision to initiate a movement seems to come after the brain's decision to initiate the movement. On assumption that the beginning of the readiness potential represents the brain's decision to initiate the movement. What we've tried to show is that the readiness potential most likely reflects internal neuronal noise, random intrinsic fluctuations in brain activity that contribute to the crossing of a threshold, which is your decision to move. So if those fluctuations change in any way the precise time at which you initiate your action, then when you look at brain data aligned to the initiation of the action, you will see this a reflection of this noise in your brain data. So what we thought was a signal saying that the brain had made a decision, was getting ready to move, according to our research and research of others, might not be a signal, it might be noise. In which case, the decision is really not made until near the end, till just before the time of the movement, which is just approximately when people assert that they became aware of their decision to move. So our research in a way undermines the previous evidence that was thought to be against free will.
Okay. And what is your plans for the future? Do you plan to prove that free will exists?
I don't think it's possible to prove that free will exists.
You sure?
So for people, I think it's possible to prove that free will doesn't exist, but it's not possible to prove that it does exist. If you want free will to exist, I think it's for you to believe in it or not, like it has always been. You either believe it exists or you don't, but I'm afraid scientists will not be able to come up with any proof that it does exist. No, I think it's just it's difficult in the way science works. It's difficult. It's problematic to prove something in the positive. We usually don't talk about proving things in science. We talk about disproving things. So if I could predict your behavior, if I could predict your every action 1 minute in advance perfectly, that might count as evidence against the possibility of free will.
Maybe you can't predict his.
Yeah, you mean someone else's?
Yeah,
what I mean is if I can predict anyone's arbitrarily, anyone's behavior based on their brain activity.
Right, but it anyway it would not prove that there would not any human being who you can't predict.
What I mean, if I set up a system, if I set up a brain scanner that could read your brain activity, and I showed that no matter who comes to visit my brain scanner, I can predict their every behavior 1 minute or 5 minutes in advance with perfect accuracy, it would be hard to sustain a claim about the existence of free will in the face of that kind of evidence.
I understand.
But doing the contrary, proving that free will does exist, I don't see how science could do that. But I think that as long as there's no evidence against free will, people will go on believing in free will or not.
What about you?
What about me? I think I'm agnostic about free will, so which is probably, since I'm trying to do science about it, it's probably good that I don't have a personal agenda. I'm just trying to get to the truth.
But doesn't you behave in a way that free will exists?
You thought?
No, like, did you make a decision to come here, for example?
I think so, but I'm not sure. So I think really I am agnostic about whether or not there's free will, in the strictest sense of the term, not free will as an uncaused cause. I think there's freedom. I think can give you freedom. Quantum mechanics tells us that there may be a certain degree of indeterminacy in the universe. That gives you freedom. And we have phenomena like cognitive control that you could call will. I just don't know how to put the two together.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Спасибо.